Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. Angela Morrison never imagined she would inherit anything from her great-aunt Ruth, a woman she had only seen once during a distant family gathering when Angela was 12 years old. Ruth had been an unmarried woman who lived alone in rural Montana. She sent Christmas cards with $5 bills tucked inside, but beyond that, she had no contact with the rest of the family. So when a lawyer from Riverside, Montana called to inform Angela that she had inherited a house, 20 acres of land, and a small savings account, the news felt like winning an unexpected lottery. The drive from Denver to Riverside took Angela through some of the most beautiful landscapes she had ever seen in her life. Rolling prairies stretched to the horizon, interrupted by clusters of cottonwood trees and the occasional lonely ranch house beneath Montana's immense sky. Riverside was exactly what she had imagined a small town with a population of 23 would be like. Main Street consisted of a few blocks of brick buildings constructed in the early 20th century, a grain elevator that dominated the town's skyline, and those wide streets that seemed to have been designed in the days of horse-drawn carriages. Her great-aunt Ruth's house stood on the outskirts of town. It was a modest two-story rural home, surrounded by fields that had been rented out to neighboring ranchers for decades. The lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Harold Perkins, met Angela at the property to give her the keys and explain the details of the inheritance. Ruth was 91 years old when she died peacefully in her sleep, he explained, and she had lived in that same house for more than 60 years. He also told her that Ruth had remained active in community affairs until the end, especially with an organization called the Riverside Brotherhood, which ran the town's food bank and homeless shelter. Angela had taken a temporary leave from her job as a marketing coordinator in Denver to spend a month in Riverside, sort through Ruth's belongings, and decide whether she would sell the property or keep it as a weekend retreat. The house was filled with objects accumulated over decades, from Depression-era furniture to boxes full of photographs documenting Ruth's involvement in different community organizations. Angela began to feel fascinated by those fragments of her great-aunt's life, especially by her extensive volunteer work with the Riverside Brotherhood. The Brotherhood had been founded in 1972 by Pastor David Brennan, a charismatic minister who had come to Riverside with the vision of creating a truly Christian community, where neighbors took care of one another and no one went hungry or was left without shelter. Unlike traditional churches, which focused mainly on Sunday services, the Brotherhood operated 7 days a week. It offered meals for the elderly, temporary lodging for families in crisis, and job training programs for anyone who needed help getting back on their feet. Angela's first contact with the Brotherhood happened on her third day in town, when Pastor Brennan knocked on her door carrying a casserole and warmly welcoming her to the community. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair, kind eyes, and such a calm way of speaking that he immediately made people feel comfortable. He explained that he had known Ruth for decades and wanted to express his condolences, as well as let her know that the Brotherhood was available to help her if she needed anything during her stay in Riverside. Pastor Brennan invited Angela to attend the Brotherhood's weekly community dinner, which was held every Wednesday night in the basement of what had once been the Methodist Church. The building had been purchased by the Brotherhood years earlier, when the Methodist congregation had dwindled to only a handful of elderly members. Angela accepted the invitation, curious to learn more about the organization that had formed such an important part of her great-aunt's life. The community dinner was exactly what Angela expected from a small-town charity event. Around 60 people gathered around long tables to share a simple but abundant meal: roast beef, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Among the attendees were older residents, young families, and a few people who appeared to be staying at the Brotherhood's homeless shelter. Before eating, Pastor Brennan led a prayer, thanking God for bringing the community together and asking for continued blessings for the work they were doing to help those in need. After dinner, Pastor Brennan gave a brief presentation about the Brotherhood's activities and encouraged everyone to help however they could. The organization operated on a very tight budget, he explained, relying entirely on donations and volunteer labor to keep its programs running. They always needed people to help serve meals, sort donations at the thrift store, or provide transportation for older residents who needed to get to medical appointments. Angela volunteered to help at the used goods store, thinking it would give her something productive to do while she continued going through Ruth's belongings. The store occupied an old auto parts shop on Main Street. Its display windows were filled with donated furniture, clothing, and household items. The person in charge was a cheerful woman in her 50s named Carol Hendress, who had been working with the Brotherhood since its earliest days and seemed to know everyone in town. Working at the store allowed Angela to observe Riverside's social dynamics from another angle. The customers were a mix of bargain hunters and people who genuinely needed affordable goods. But Carol had an almost unsettling ability to distinguish between the two groups. She offered discreet discounts to regular customers who were going through financial hardship or allowed them to take items without paying, while tourists passing through town paid full price for the same merchandise. It was during her second week as a volunteer that Angela began to notice certain troubling patterns in the way the Brotherhood operated. On several occasions, she saw Carol having quiet conversations with certain customers, arrangements that seemed to involve something more than simply buying used clothing or furniture. Those conversations always took place near the back of the store, away from the other customers, and without exception, they ended with the person leaving through the rear door instead of the main entrance. Angela's curiosity grew even more when she discovered that the store's back room contained far more merchandise than could ever fit in the main sales area. Boxes and bags of donated items were stacked to the ceiling, forming narrow aisles between towering walls of accumulated objects. Carol explained that they were always behind on processing donations, but something about that explanation did not sound convincing to Angela. Why would a charity store hold back merchandise if it needed money to fund its programs? The answer began to become clearer when Angela volunteered to help with the Brotherhood's weekly food distribution. Every Saturday morning, volunteers loaded trucks with groceries and delivered them to elderly residents and families who could not travel to the organization's main headquarters. Angela was assigned to accompany a driver named Tom Martinez, a quiet man in his 30s who seemed uncomfortable with casual conversation, but knew exactly where to find every recipient on the route. The food delivery route took them to some of the poorest areas around Riverside, including a cluster of mobile homes near the railroad tracks and several isolated farms where elderly people lived alone. At each stop, Tom carried the food boxes to the door while Angela waited in the truck. She noticed that the conversations at each doorway lasted much longer than necessary for a simple food delivery, and that the recipients frequently handed Tom envelopes or small packages before he returned to the vehicle. When Angela asked Tom why those conversations lasted so long, he became evasive and changed the subject. The people on the route were grateful for the Brotherhood's help, he said, and sometimes wanted to talk about their lives or share news about their families. It was an important part of the organization's mission, he added, to provide not only material assistance but also human connection to isolated members of the community. Angela might have accepted that explanation if not for what she discovered among Ruth's personal papers. Hidden inside a shoebox at the back of her great-aunt's closet, she found a collection of documents that showed a very different picture of the Riverside Brotherhood's activities. Bank statements revealed that Ruth had been making monthly payments to the Brotherhood for years, amounts far larger than would be reasonable as donations to a charity. Even more disturbing were handwritten notes in Ruth's careful handwriting, in which she documented her concerns about the Brotherhood's special services and her fear that she was being watched by other members of the organization. One note dated only 3 months before Ruth's death was particularly chilling. In it, Ruth wrote that she had discovered the true purpose of the Brotherhood's food distribution program and that she planned to contact authorities outside Riverside. She was convinced that Pastor Brennan and his inner circle were using the organization's charitable work as a front for illegal activities, possibly involving the elderly residents who received frequent visits from the Brotherhood's volunteers. Ruth's final note expressed her terror at the possibility that the Brotherhood had discovered her suspicions. She wrote that her house was being watched, that her phone calls were being monitored, and that she was afraid to leave her property alone. She had hidden copies of the evidence in several places throughout the house, hoping that someday someone would find them and reveal the truth about the Riverside Brotherhood's operations. Angela spent the next 2 days searching every corner of Ruth's house, following the clues left in her great-aunt's cryptic notes. In the basement, hidden behind a loose stone in the foundation wall, she found a manila envelope containing photographs, financial records, and a detailed diary documenting the Brotherhood's criminal activities. The evidence revealed a network of systematic exploitation that had operated for decades under the disguise of Christian charity. The Brotherhood's food distribution program was actually a drug trafficking network that used elderly residents as unwilling intermediaries. Volunteers delivered bags of food containing hidden packages of illegal substances, then collected payment and redistributed the drugs through the thrift store and other Brotherhood operations. Elderly recipients who began to suspect the truth or threatened to report the activities were systematically isolated and eventually eliminated through carefully administered overdoses that appeared to be natural deaths. Ruth's diary documented at least 15 suspicious deaths among the Brotherhood's food recipients over the past 10 years. All of the victims were elderly people who had died alone in their homes after expressing concerns about the organization's activities. The local sheriff, Rita Valdez, was either complicit in the cover-up or completely incompetent, since none of those deaths had led to serious investigations despite the obvious pattern. Even more terrifying was Ruth's discovery that the Brotherhood was also involved in elder abuse and large-scale financial exploitation. The organization systematically identified older residents who lived in isolation, gained their trust through charitable services, and then gradually took control of their finances and medical care. Victims were encouraged to name the Brotherhood as a beneficiary in their wills, and afterward they died under suspicious circumstances that allowed the organization to inherit their properties and assets. Angela realized that she was in immediate danger. If the Brotherhood had killed Ruth to prevent her from exposing their activities, they would not hesitate to eliminate Ruth's heir as well, now that she had the evidence in her hands. She placed the most incriminating documents in her car and drove directly to the state capitol, where she presented the evidence to the Montana Attorney General's office and requested protection for herself and for any other potential witnesses. The investigation that followed revealed the true scale of the Riverside Brotherhood's criminal enterprise. Pastor David Brennan and 12 of his associates were arrested on charges ranging from drug trafficking to elder abuse and multiple counts of murder. The organization had been responsible for the deaths of at least 23 people over a 15-year period, using its charitable work as the perfect cover to systematically exploit the most vulnerable members of the community. Sheriff Rita Valdez was also arrested, accused of corruption and obstruction of justice for her role in covering up the Brotherhood's crimes. The investigation revealed that she had received regular payments from the organization and had deliberately avoided investigating the suspicious deaths among elderly residents. Angela Morrison never returned to Riverside after testifying at the trial. She sold her great-aunt's property and donated the proceeds to legitimate organizations that truly helped elderly residents. The house where Ruth had lived and died now remains empty, its windows boarded up, as a silent monument to the victims of a charitable organization that used compassion as a weapon against the very people it pretended to serve. Story 2. Marcus Whitfield had spent more than 15 years covering small-town politics for the Burlington Herald, but nothing had prepared him for what he would eventually uncover in Millfield, Vermont. The assignment seemed fairly routine when his editor handed it to him on a gray October morning. The town, with barely 847 residents, had been selected to receive a state historic heritage grant worth $2 million, and the newspaper wanted a positive piece, the kind that highlighted how rural communities fought to preserve their historic character. But what Marcus discovered instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. Millfield sat nestled in a valley between rolling hills covered with sugar maples, their leaves burning in shades of red and gold beneath the autumn light. Main Street looked as if it had been taken from a Norman Rockwell painting, with a white church topped by a pointed steeple, a general store with wooden floors that creaked underfoot, and houses with wraparound porches where elderly residents waved from their rocking chairs. The Millfield Preservation Society had done an exceptional job maintaining the town's 19th century charm, even preserving gas street lamps that cast warm circles of light onto the sidewalks every night. Eleanor Ashworth, the society's president, welcomed Marcus at the town's small historical museum on his first day. She was a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back into an impeccable bun and a measured way of speaking that suggested decades of experience addressing the public. Her handshake was firm, her smile welcoming, and her knowledge of local history seemed encyclopedic. She guided him through exhibits of Civil War artifacts, farming tools from the earliest settlers, and sepia photographs of residents who had died long ago, whose descendants still lived in the same houses their great-great-grandparents had built. The Preservation Society had been founded in 1968, Eleanor explained, when real estate developers from Boston threatened to build a shopping center on the outskirts of town. A group of concerned citizens joined together to protect Millfield's identity, and eventually succeeded in having the entire downtown district listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Since then, the society had grown to include practically every business owner and prominent family in town. They controlled what could be built, what could be renovated, and what had to be preserved exactly as it was. Marcus spent his first few days interviewing lifelong residents and photographing the immaculate Victorian houses lining Elm Street. Everyone he spoke with praised the work of the Preservation Society. The town had avoided the roadside shopping centers and chain restaurants that had invaded other rural communities. Property values had remained stable even during economic downturns. Young families were moving to Millfield precisely because it offered the kind of safe, traditional atmosphere that seemed to be disappearing everywhere in New England. But as he moved forward with his report, Marcus began to notice subtle details that made him uncomfortable. When he asked about families that had moved away from Millfield, the conversations became awkward and vague. People mentioned that one person or another had decided to try their luck elsewhere, or had found better opportunities in the city, but no one could provide concrete details about where those former residents had gone or what they were doing now. When Marcus asked for contact information so he could interview some of those families and get a broader perspective on the town's development, he was told that most people had lost touch with them over the years. The town's public records also seemed strangely incomplete. The municipal clerk's office had meticulous documentation dating back to the 19th century, but there were inexplicable gaps in more recent decades. Death certificates, property transfers, and even high school graduation records seemed to be missing from certain years, especially in the late 1980s and the mid-1990s. When Marcus asked about those absences, he was told that there had been a fire in the basement storage area and that some documents had been damaged beyond recovery. Deputy Sheriff Jim Kowski was the only person Marcus found who seemed genuinely uncomfortable when talking about the Preservation Society. Jim was a large man in his 40s who had grown up in Millfield, left to attend college and serve for a while in the military, and then returned home to join the town's small police force. When Marcus interviewed him in the tiny police station, Jim kept glancing toward the door and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. The Preservation Society was certainly committed to maintaining the town's character, Jim said, but sometimes its methods were somewhat extreme. They held an unofficial authority that went far beyond anything listed in any municipal code. If someone wanted to change the color of their shutters or replace the front steps, they needed the society's approval. If a business wanted to update its sign or alter the storefront, Eleanor Ashworth and her committee had the final say. Those who ignored those unwritten rules often found themselves facing endless bureaucratic obstacles, unexpected tax assessments, or mysterious problems with their utilities. Jim told Marcus about a young couple who had moved to Millfield 3 years earlier and bought a run-down house on Maple Street. They had big plans to renovate the property and turn it into a bed and breakfast that would attract tourists interested in the town's historic character. But they made the mistake of beginning the work without consulting the Preservation Society first. Less than a week after the renovations began, they received citations for code violations. Their building permits were mysteriously revoked, and their contractor began receiving anonymous threats that convinced him to abandon the project. The couple tried for months to fight those administrative roadblocks, but in the end they gave up and sold the house to Eleanor Ashworth's nephew for a fraction of what they had invested. Marcus asked Jim whether he had investigated the anonymous threats against the contractor, but the deputy sheriff simply shrugged. The contractor had never filed an official complaint, and without a formal report, there was nothing to investigate. Besides, Jim added with a bitter smile, the Preservation Society had been very generous to the police department over the years. Its annual fundraising dinner had paid for new equipment, vehicle upgrades, and even salary increases for Jim. It would be difficult to investigate people who were, in practice, almost his employers. The conversation with Deputy Kowski left Marcus with more questions than answers, so he decided to dig deeper into the Preservation Society's finances. As a nonprofit organization, its tax records were public, but obtaining them required a formal request to the state. While he waited for those documents, Marcus drove to the county seat and spent a day at the courthouse reviewing property transfers and business licenses. What he found there chilled him to the bone. Over the past 20 years, the Preservation Society had acquired ownership of more than 60% of Millfield's residential homes. Some of those acquisitions were direct purchases, but more often they involved complex arrangements in which the society bought a mortgage from the bank and then foreclosed on the property when the owner experienced financial difficulties. In several cases, the society had purchased properties from families that suddenly decided to leave town, often selling below market value, as if they were desperate to leave as quickly as possible. The pattern became even more disturbing when Marcus cross-referenced those property transfers with missing persons reports in neighboring towns. At least 12 people who had sold properties to the Preservation Society had never been seen again after leaving Millfield. Their families had filed missing persons reports with the state police, but the investigations had gone nowhere. The missing individuals apparently had withdrawn their savings in cash, left their jobs without notice, and disappeared without contacting family or friends. The state police had classified those cases as voluntary disappearances by adults who had decided to start new lives somewhere else. Marcus tried to contact some relatives of those missing people, but the conversations were frustrating and terrifying. The family members were reluctant to talk about their absent loved ones, and several people hung up when Marcus identified himself as a journalist. One woman, the sister of a man who had disappeared after selling his house to the Preservation Society, agreed to meet Marcus at a restaurant 30 miles from Millfield. She arrived constantly looking over her shoulder and speaking in whispers, clearly terrified that someone might overhear their conversation. Her brother had been planning to move to Florida after retiring from his job at the paper mill, she explained. He had lived in the same house all his life, had raised his children there after his wife's death, and was looking forward to a quiet retirement somewhere warm. But something changed during his final weeks in Millfield. He became paranoid and nervous, convinced that someone was watching his house and following him around town. He told his sister that he had discovered something terrible about the Preservation Society, something that put him in danger. Before he could explain to her what he had found out, he died. The official cause of death was recorded as a heart attack, but his sister never believed that explanation. Her brother had been in excellent health and had no history of heart problems. More importantly, his body was found in the basement of his house, which made no sense because he never went down there. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, and his arthritis made it difficult for him to use them safely. The Preservation Society had arranged a quick cremation before his sister could request an autopsy, claiming that her brother had specified cremation in a will no one had ever seen. Marcus left that conversation with a growing certainty. He was not investigating something related only to historic preservation, but something far more sinister. The missing people, the property acquisitions, the incomplete records, and the atmosphere of fear that seemed to permeate the town all pointed to a conspiracy that had been operating for decades. But he needed solid proof, something more powerful than suspicious coincidences and fearful whispers. His major breakthrough came when he finally received the Preservation Society's financial records from the state. Hidden among pages of routine expenses and fundraising income was a series of payments to a company called Heritage Transport Services. Those payments, totaling more than $800,000 over a 5-year period, were listed as restoration consulting fees, but the amounts were far too high for any legitimate consulting work. When Marcus investigated Heritage Transport Services, he discovered that it was a shell company with no employees, no office, and no real business operations. The company's only registered asset was a fleet of refrigerated trucks. Marcus spent a sleepless night in his hotel room trying to sort through the implications of what he had discovered. A preservation society with access to refrigerated trucks, a pattern of missing people who had owned valuable property, and a town where asking too many questions could be dangerous. The conclusion was almost too horrible to accept, but the evidence was overwhelming. The Millfield Preservation Society was not only preserving historic buildings, it was systematically murdering residents who represented a threat to its operations, disposing of the bodies afterward, and taking possession of their properties. The next morning, Marcus packed his belongings and left the hotel before dawn. He had enough evidence to write his story, but he needed to get as far away from Millfield as possible before publishing it. As he drove through the town center for the last time, Eleanor Ashworth stepped out of the historical museum and waved goodbye with her characteristic warm smile. Marcus waved back, fighting the urge to slam his foot on the gas and flee as fast as his car could carry him. 3 weeks later, Marcus Whitfield's investigation appeared on the front page of newspapers across New England. Within hours, state and federal law enforcement agencies launched a massive investigation into the Millfield Preservation Society. What they discovered was even worse than Marcus had suspected. The society had been operating a sophisticated human trafficking network, abducting residents who threatened to expose its activities and selling them to criminal organizations in major cities. The refrigerated trucks were used to transport victims who had been drugged and told that they were being relocated for new jobs in other states. Eleanor Ashworth and 14 other members of the society were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and organized crime. The investigation revealed that the society had been responsible for the deaths of at least 37 people over 2 decades. Many of the missing people had not left town voluntarily. They had been murdered in the basement of the historical museum. Their bodies were dissolved in acid, and their properties were seized through forged documents. Marcus Whitfield received a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative journalism, but the recognition brought him no satisfaction. He had exposed a monstrous conspiracy, but he could not bring the victims back to life or undo the years of terror that had dominated Millfield. The town still exists today, with its Victorian houses and gas street lamps preserved exactly as they were, but most of the buildings now remain empty. Few people want to live in a place where a society dedicated to historic preservation became a criminal organization that murdered anyone who threatened its perfect vision of small-town America. Story 3. Tommy Rodriguez had saved for 3 years to open his automotive repair shop in Cedar Grove, Alabama, a small town of 2,156 residents located along Highway 82 between Montgomery and Tuscaloosa. The town had seemed perfect for his business project when he first visited it in the spring of 2021. Main Street still preserved the structure of past prosperity, with solid brick buildings that decades earlier had housed thriving businesses during the cotton boom years. The rent was affordable, the location offered good visibility from the highway, and it was obvious that there was a real need for honest automotive service in a community where many residents drove older vehicles that required frequent maintenance. Tommy had grown up in Birmingham, the son of Mexican immigrants who had taught him the value of hard work and the importance of treating customers fairly. He had spent 15 years working in other people's shops, learning every aspect of auto repair while saving money and building a reputation based on reliable service. When he finally opened Rodriguez Auto Service in an old gas station on the edge of Cedar Grove's downtown district, he felt that he was achieving the American dream for which his parents had sacrificed so much. The first few months went exactly as Tommy had hoped. In the small town, word spread quickly. The new mechanic was honest, competent, and charged fair prices for his work. Farmers brought in their pickup trucks. Older residents trusted him to take care of their meticulously maintained sedans, and young families appreciated that he took the time to explain what was wrong with their vehicles and offer options that fit their budgets. Tommy hired 2 part-time employees and began looking into the possibility of buying the building where his shop operated. His first encounter with the Cedar Grove Business Alliance happened on a suffocating Tuesday morning in August, when a black Cadillac pulled into his parking lot and 3 people dressed in expensive suits stepped out of the vehicle. The leader was a large man in his 60s named Frank Buchanan, who introduced himself as the executive director of the alliance. He was accompanied by Mayor Patricia Donnelly, a sharp-eyed woman who had held office for 12 years, and a man named Charles Webb, identified only as a key community stakeholder. Frank Buchanan's manner was friendly but firm as he explained that the Business Alliance functioned as a kind of unofficial chamber of commerce for Cedar Grove. Its goal, according to him, was to help coordinate economic development and ensure that new businesses integrated properly into the community. All business owners in town were expected to join the alliance and participate in its activities, which included monthly meetings, community fundraising events, and cooperative advertising campaigns to promote Cedar Grove as a destination for shoppers and tourists. The membership fee was $500 a month, plus additional contributions for special projects and community improvements. In exchange, Alliance members received priority consideration for municipal contracts, favorable treatment on zoning and permit applications, and protection against unfair competition. Frank emphasized that last point with particular intensity, explaining that the alliance worked hard to make sure established businesses were not harmed by newcomers who did not understand local market conditions. Tommy politely declined the invitation to join, explaining that he preferred to focus on providing good service to his customers instead of getting involved in the town's business politics. His shop was doing well on its own, he said, and he did not see the need to pay monthly dues for benefits he did not need. The three visitors exchanged glances at his response, and Mayor Donnelly wrote something in a folder before leaving without further argument. Within a week, Tommy began experiencing problems that seemed designed to drive him out of business. The municipal building inspector arrived without notice to conduct a thorough review of his shop, pointing out violations that had never been mentioned during previous inspections. 2 days later, the fire chief appeared, ordering expensive modifications to Tommy's electrical system and threatening to shut down the business if the work was not completed within 30 days. The following week, a representative from the State Environmental Protection Agency showed up, claiming that someone had reported improper disposal of automotive fluids. Each inspection resulted in fines and mandatory upgrades that cost Tommy thousands of dollars he had not planned to spend on regulatory compliance. Even more concerning was the way his customer base began to shrink without explanation. Regular customers stopped bringing their vehicles to his shop, often offering vague excuses about having found a service closer to their homes or having decided to take their cars to dealerships in Montgomery. Tommy suspected that the business alliance was behind his problems, but he had no proof of coordination between the organization and the various government agencies that were suddenly examining his operations under a microscope. When he complained to municipal officials about the harassment, he was told that all inspections were routine and that any business owner who maintained proper standards had nothing to worry about. The situation escalated when Tommy discovered that someone was spreading rumors about his shop throughout the town. Customers began asking him whether it was true that he used low-quality parts, that he had been cited for environmental violations, and that his insurance might not cover work performed at his facility. Tommy tried to counter those rumors by offering references and guaranteeing his work, but the damage to his reputation was beginning to become irreversible. His first real indication of the alliance's methods came when Janet Morris, an elderly woman who had been one of his first customers, stopped by the shop late one night after closing time. Janet had brought her aging Buick to Tommy for routine maintenance, and he had always appreciated her direct manner and her punctuality when paying. But she had not returned to the shop in more than a month, even though she had previously scheduled regular appointments. Janet seemed nervous as she explained that Frank Buchanan had approached her at the grocery store and told her that Tommy's shop was being investigated by state authorities for fraudulent business practices. Buchanan had implied that customers who continued using Rodriguez Auto Service could face legal complications if the investigation resulted in criminal charges. He had also mentioned that Alliance member businesses offered special discounts to residents who could prove they were supporting local entrepreneurs instead of outside competitors. Tommy was furious, though not surprised by Buchanan's tactics. What did shock him was Janet's revelation about how the Alliance enforced its control over the local economy. Business owners who refused to join the organization not only faced regulatory harassment and attacks on their reputations, but also direct sabotage against their operations. Janet had heard stories about businesses not affiliated with the Alliance suffering thefts, vandalism, and mysterious equipment failures that forced them to close permanently. The Alliance's power went far beyond informal influence, Janet explained. Frank Buchanan's family had owned Cedar Grove's largest employer for 3 generations, a textile factory that provided work for more than 200 people. Mayor Donnelly's husband was the president of the town's only bank, an institution that held the mortgages and business loans of much of the local population. Charles Webb owned the largest farm in the county and controlled agricultural supply contracts on which dozens of small farmers depended for their livelihoods. Together, these three individuals and their allies could make life impossible for anyone who challenged their authority. They could deny loans, cancel contracts, eliminate jobs, and coordinate government harassment until their targets had no choice but to leave town or submit to the alliance's control. Over the years, they had driven out dozens of potential competitors and forced all remaining businesses to accept their terms in order to continue operating in Cedar Grove. Tommy understood that he was facing a choice between joining a criminal conspiracy or losing everything he had worked for. The alliance functioned in essence as an extortion network that collected monthly payments from business owners in exchange for allowing them to operate without interference. Those who paid the dues received preferential treatment and protection from competition, while those who refused were systematically destroyed through coordinated attacks on their finances, their reputation, and their physical assets. The decision became clearer when Tommy discovered evidence of the alliance's most serious crime. While researching property records at the courthouse, he found documentation of suspicious title transfers connected to businesses that had been forced to close after refusing to join the alliance. In each case, the failed business had been purchased for a fraction of its value by shell companies that were later revealed to be controlled by alliance members. Even more disturbing was the pattern of insurance claims filed by alliance members whose properties had suffered conveniently timed accidents that eliminated the competition. A restaurant that refused to join the alliance had burned down under mysterious circumstances, and the insurance payout allowed the owner of an alliance member restaurant to expand into the empty location. A competing auto repair shop had been destroyed by a gas explosion that investigators attributed to equipment failure, despite the owner's insistence that the equipment had been inspected recently and was properly maintained. Tommy began secretly documenting his interactions with alliance members and government officials, recording conversations and photographing evidence of the coordinated harassment he was experiencing. He also contacted business owners in neighboring towns who had dealt with similar organizations, hoping to build a case that would expose the alliance's illegal activities. His investigation revealed that the Cedar Grove Business Alliance was part of a broader network of similar organizations operating in rural Alabama. These groups used identical tactics to control local economies, sharing strategies and resources to eliminate competition and maximize profits for their members. The network included corrupt officials at multiple levels of government, creating a protection system that made it extremely difficult for victims to find help through normal legal channels. Tommy's evidence gathering was interrupted when his shop was broken into one Sunday night in October. The intruders did not steal anything of obvious value, but they searched his filing cabinets and office computer, clearly looking for specific information. Tommy understood that the Alliance had discovered his investigation and that it would soon intensify its efforts to force him to shut down the business. Instead of waiting for the situation to worsen even further, Tommy contacted the local FBI office in Birmingham and requested a meeting with agents specializing in organized crime and public corruption cases. The evidence he had gathered, combined with similar complaints from business owners in other towns, provided the basis for a federal investigation that would eventually expose the Alliance's criminal activities. The FBI investigation revealed that the Cedar Grove Business Alliance and its affiliated organizations had been operating what amounted to a criminal enterprise for more than 20 years. Frank Buchanan, Mayor Patricia Donnelly, Charles Webb, and 14 other Alliance members were charged with organized crime, extortion, conspiracy, and arson. The investigation also led to corruption charges against officials from several government agencies who had participated in the harassment of business owners who refused to submit. Tommy Rodriguez eventually reopened his automotive repair shop after the arrest of the Alliance's leaders. But the experience forever changed his view of small-town America. He had discovered that the picturesque communities portrayed in movies and television shows could hide sophisticated criminal organizations that controlled every aspect of local economic life. The American dream was still possible, but only for those willing to fight against the forces that sought to turn entrepreneurship into extortion and community cooperation into criminal conspiracy. Cedar Grove today is slowly recovering from decades of control by the Alliance, but the town's economy remains fragile. Many of the businesses driven out during the organization's reign of terror never returned, leaving empty storefronts along Main Street as monuments to the entrepreneurs who refused to pay protection money to, criminals hiding behind the respectable facade of business development and community service. Story 4. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had always been fascinated by the gaps in local history, by those stories that communities preferred not to remember. As a professor of American Studies at Kansas State University, she had dedicated her career to researching the darker chapters of small-town life, those that were often excluded from official records and carefully polished historical accounts. When the Harmony Historical Committee invited her to research and write a commemorative book for the town's sesquicentennial celebration, Sarah saw it as an opportunity to examine the social dynamics of a community that had remained remarkably isolated, despite being located only 40 miles from Topeka. Harmony, Kansas had a population of 934 residents, most of whom could trace their family roots in the area back at least 3 generations. The town had been founded in 1873 by German immigrants who purchased a large stretch of prairie land from the railroad company. Unlike many Kansas settlements that had prospered and then declined with agricultural cycles, Harmony had maintained a stable population and relative prosperity, thanks to careful community planning and conservative financial management. The historical committee was led by Councilman Robert Hayes, whose great-grandfather had been one of the town's original settlers. Robert was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who ran the local insurance agency and had served on the town council for more than a decade. He explained to Sarah that the committee wanted a complete history that celebrated Harmony's achievements, while also preserving the stories of the families who had built the community over 5 generations. Sarah was granted access to the town archives, stored in the basement of the public library under the supervision of Grace Peterson, the head librarian, who had worked there for 37 years. The collection included town council minutes, school board records, church files, and hundreds of photographs documenting community events from the late 19th century to the present. Grace was knowledgeable and helpful, but Sarah noticed that certain periods of the town's history were poorly documented compared with others. The most obvious gap corresponded to the 1960s, when Harmony had experienced significant changes that were mentioned in passing but never explained in detail. References in the town council minutes suggested major population turnover, property sales, and the creation of new community organizations. However, the supporting documents that would have explained those changes were not in the archives. Grace explained that there had been a flood in the library basement in the 1980s, and that many old records had been damaged beyond recovery. Sarah began interviewing longtime residents to fill the gaps in the written record, but she soon encountered resistance whenever she asked about the 1960s. The elderly residents became vague and uncomfortable when discussing that period, offering general phrases about difficult times and community challenges but providing no concrete details. Younger residents seemed genuinely unaware that anything important had happened, suggesting that the history had been deliberately forgotten rather than passed down within families. Her first major breakthrough came when she discovered a private collection of documents in the estate of a woman who had died the previous year. The woman's daughter, who was cleaning out her mother's house before putting it up for sale, had found a box with newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes that her mother had apparently hidden in the attic. The daughter offered to let Sarah examine the materials, hoping they might be useful for the historical project. The documents showed a disturbing picture of the events that occurred in Harmony during the summer of 1965. According to newspaper articles from the time published in nearby towns, Harmony had been the site of a mass disappearance that attracted the attention of state and federal law enforcement agencies. 13 families, totaling 57 people, had disappeared from the community over a 6-week period. Their houses had been left intact, their belongings remained in place, and their bank accounts had not been touched, but the people themselves had simply vanished without explanation. The missing families were all relatively new to Harmony, having moved to the area within the previous 5 years. They represented different backgrounds and economic circumstances, but they shared one characteristic that distinguished them from longtime residents. All of them had expressed interest in modernizing various aspects of community life, from updating the school curriculum to allowing stores to open on Sundays, to permitting social dances at community events. Their disappearances had effectively ended all discussion of social changes that might challenge Harmony's traditional values. Sarah found additional documentation in old Kansas City newspapers, which had covered the case as a regional mystery. State police had conducted a massive investigation, interviewing hundreds of residents and searching thousands of acres of farmland for evidence of what had happened to the missing families. The investigation was hindered by the community's insistence that the families had simply decided to move elsewhere, despite the lack of evidence supporting a voluntary relocation. The newspaper coverage revealed details that made Sarah's blood run cold. Several of the missing families had told friends and relatives in other towns that they planned to remain in Harmony permanently, as they had made significant investments in local properties and businesses. Some had enrolled their children in school for the upcoming academic year. One family was even building a new house, with construction materials already delivered to the lot when they disappeared. Even more disturbing was the timing of the disappearances, shortly after those families began organizing to question certain community decisions. They had challenged the historical committee's control over property development, opposed religious requirements for participation in civic activities, and advocated for more inclusive policies toward newcomers who did not share the community's German Lutheran heritage. Sarah realized that she had stumbled upon evidence of what appeared to be the systematic elimination of community members who threatened the established social order. The historical committee, rather than being a benign organization dedicated to preserving local culture, seemed to have acted as the coordinating body of a conspiracy that had resulted in the disappearance of nearly 60 people. Her investigation took a dangerous turn when she tried to verify details from the newspaper articles by examining official records at the county courthouse. The sheriff's department files for 1965 were missing. They had supposedly been lost during an office renovation in the early 1990s. Property records showed that the houses and businesses belonging to the missing families had been sold months after their disappearances, but the sales had been handled through a legal process that seemed designed to conceal the real buyers. Sarah discovered that most of the missing families' properties had eventually ended up in the hands of long-established Harmony residents, often at prices far below market value. The transactions had been processed by a law firm in Topeka that had since closed, and the attorney who had handled the sales had died years earlier. The pattern suggested the systematic theft of property belonging to families who were no longer alive to defend their interests. When Sarah tried to discuss her findings with Robert Hayes, his reaction confirmed her worst suspicions about the historical committee's involvement in the cover-up. Hayes became nervous and defensive, insisting that Sarah was misinterpreting historical events and drawing conclusions that were not supported by reliable evidence. He suggested that she focus her research on more positive aspects of Harmony's development, especially the community's achievements in agriculture and education. Hayes also mentioned that the committee had concerns about Sarah's research methods and wondered whether she was really the right person to write the commemorative book. Other members of the committee, he said, had expressed reservations about working with an outside researcher who might not understand the community's values and priorities. Perhaps it would be better to find a local writer with deeper ties to Harmony and a greater appreciation for its traditions. Sarah understood the implied threat in Hayes's comments, but she was determined to discover the truth about what had happened to the missing families. She began working in secret, making copies of documents and conducting interviews outside Harmony to avoid alerting committee members to the direction her investigation was taking. She also contacted law enforcement agencies to ask about the possibility of reopening the case, but she was told that the statute of limitations had expired for most of the possible crimes and that the lack of physical evidence made a formal indictment impossible. Her investigation revealed that the disappearances of 1965 had not been an isolated incident. Similar patterns of sudden population turnover had occurred in Harmony during other periods when community cohesion had been threatened by outside influences. During the Great Depression, several families who had advocated for federal assistance programs had mysteriously moved away. In the early 1950s, supporters of racial integration abruptly left town after the Supreme Court decisions on desegregation. The historical committee had been involved in all of these episodes, acting as the unofficial authority that decided which residents were welcome in Harmony and which ones represented a threat to community stability. The committee's power came from its control over local institutions, including the school board, town council, and various business organizations. Its members could, in practice, ostracize selected families, denying them employment, services, and social acceptance until they had no choice but to leave. Sarah's final discovery came when she found evidence that the historical committee's activities had continued in recent decades, though with methods less dramatic than a mass disappearance. Families that questioned community decisions or advocated for unwanted changes were systematically harassed until they chose to move away. Then their departure was explained as a voluntary decision to seek better opportunities elsewhere, maintaining the fiction that Harmony was a harmonious community where everyone was welcome. When Sarah tried to present her findings to law enforcement authorities, she discovered that several key figures in the county sheriff's department were related to current and former members of the historical committee. Her investigation had been monitored from the beginning, and community leaders were already taking steps to discredit her work and prevent the publication of her discoveries. Sarah Mitchell never completed the commemorative history of Harmony, Kansas. She resigned from the project after receiving threats against her family and being informed that her academic position could be put at risk if she continued her investigation. The historical committee eventually hired a local writer to produce a sanitized version of the town's development, one that mentioned neither the missing families nor the systematic elimination of dissenting residents. The commemorative book was published in time for Harmony's sesquicentennial celebration, filled with photographs of smiling families and moving stories about community cooperation. Visitors who attended the celebration commented on how well-preserved the town looked and how friendly its residents were. Few of them understood that they were walking through a community where challenging the established order could still prove fatal to anyone naive enough to believe that small towns in America were truly the democratic and inclusive places they pretended to be. Story 5. Jennifer Walsh thought she had finally found the perfect suburban paradise when she moved to Willowbrook, Ohio, in the spring of 2022. The town, with 3,411 residents, sat in an affluent area of rolling hills 30 minutes from Columbus, where tree-lined streets wound between colonial and Tudor-style homes, all maintained with almost flawless precision. Every yard displayed professional landscaping, and the town center looked as if it had come out of a lifestyle magazine, with its boutique shops, artisan cafes, and weekly farmers market. Jennifer had relocated from Chicago after accepting a marketing position at a technology company that allowed her to work remotely. She was recently divorced, wanted to start over, and was drawn to Willowbrook's reputation as a safe, family-friendly community where neighbors still looked out for one another. The house she bought was a 1920s brick colonial on Maple Avenue, with a wraparound porch and a backyard that the previous owners had maintained with obvious pride and considerable skill. Within a few days of moving in, Jennifer received a handwritten invitation to join the Willowbrook Garden Club. The invitation was delivered to her door by an elegant woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Victoria Sterling. The club had been founded in 1948, Victoria explained, and had grown to include most of the women in Willowbrook who took pride in their homes and gardens. The members met twice a month for educational programs, social activities, and community service projects that kept the town beautiful throughout the year. The monthly dues were modest, Victoria said. In addition, the club offered numerous benefits, including group discounts at local nurseries, access to the knowledge of master gardeners within the membership, and participation in the annual home and garden tour, Willowbrook's most important social event. More importantly, belonging to the club provided opportunities to connect with other women who shared an interest in creating beautiful living spaces and preserving community standards that protected everyone's property values. Jennifer was pleased to be welcomed into the community so quickly and accepted the invitation without hesitation. Her first garden club meeting was held in the fellowship hall of the Presbyterian Church, where 35 women gathered for coffee, pastries, and a presentation on native Ohio wildflowers. The atmosphere was warm and sophisticated, with members dressed in the kind of quietly expensive clothing that suggested comfortable financial standing without slipping into ostentation. Victoria Sterling clearly commanded respect as club president, a position she had held for more than a decade. She ran the meetings with parliamentary efficiency, announced upcoming events with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her decisions accepted without question, and offered gardening advice with the authority of genuine experience. The other members deferred to her opinions and competed for her approval in a way that reminded Jennifer of high school social dynamics, though carried out with the refinement that came from decades of adult maturity. The club's community service projects were impressive both in scope and impact. The members organized neighborhood cleanups, maintained flower gardens in public spaces, and coordinated with municipal officials to ensure that Willowbrook's property maintenance standards were applied consistently. The club also operated an informal welcoming committee that helped new residents integrate into the community while learning local expectations about home and garden care. Jennifer enjoyed the social aspects of belonging to the club and discovered that being part of the organization opened doors for her throughout Willowbrook. Shopkeepers were friendlier, service providers gave priority to club members, and her neighbors treated her with the kind of respect that came from being accepted by the community's unofficial leadership. The garden club clearly exercised influence that went far beyond horticulture and home decoration. Her first sign that the club's activities might include darker elements came during a conversation about a family that had recently moved away from Willowbrook. The Hendersons had lived on the same street as Jennifer, in a beautiful Tudor revival home that, in theory, should have fit perfectly with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. But according to the whispered conversations during coffee hour, the family had struggled to maintain their property properly and had made several landscaping decisions that other residents considered inappropriate. The Hendersons had planted vegetables in the front yard, installed solar panels on the roof, and allowed their children to play in ways other neighbors considered too loud and disruptive. More problematic still, Mrs. Henderson had refused to join the garden club despite receiving multiple invitations. explaining that she preferred to devote her volunteer time to environmental activism and social justice causes, which she considered more important than neighborhood beautification. According to Victoria Sterling, the Hendersons had eventually understood that Willowbrook was not the right community for their lifestyle and had decided to move somewhere more compatible with their values. Their house had sold quickly to a lovely family that already understood the importance of maintaining neighborhood standards. Jennifer found the story unsettling because she remembered hearing the Hendersons talk about how much they loved their house and their plans to live there permanently. Still, she assumed circumstances must have changed in ways an outsider could not fully understand. Her concerns intensified when she witnessed the garden club's reaction to another family whose property maintenance had become problematic. The Kramers lived in a 1930s colonial house that had been beautifully cared for until Mr. Kramer developed health problems that made it difficult for him to tend to their extensive gardens. The couple was elderly and lived on a fixed income that did not allow them to pay for professional landscaping services. So their once immaculate yard gradually began to fill with weeds and equipment they could no longer manage. Instead of offering help to the elderly couple who were struggling, several members of the garden club began a campaign of subtle harassment designed to pressure them into selling their home. Anonymous complaints were filed with the Municipal Code Enforcement Department, resulting in violation notices for minor infractions that had been ignored when the property was well maintained. Neighbors began making loud comments about declining property values whenever they passed the Kramers' house, making sure the elderly couple could hear their disapproval. Jennifer suggested that the garden club organize volunteers to help the Kramers maintain their yard, but Victoria Sterling dismissed the idea with a cold smile. The club's mission was to preserve community standards, not enable residents to neglect their responsibilities. If the Kramers were no longer capable of maintaining their property properly, the kindest thing would be to help them understand that they needed to move into a more suitable housing situation. The systematic campaign against the Kramers intensified when the couple received a letter from their homeowner's insurance company, threatening to cancel their coverage because of safety risks that had been reported by anonymous neighbors. Their property taxes were reassessed at a higher rate, despite the obvious deterioration in the condition of the house. Contractors who had previously provided them with services suddenly became unavailable or dramatically raised their prices. Within 6 months, the Kramers sold their house to a real estate developer, who extensively renovated it before selling it to a young family that immediately joined the garden club and began participating enthusiastically in community activities. Jennifer never learned where the elderly couple had moved, and none of the club members seemed interested in keeping in touch with them after they left Willowbrook. The pattern became clear when Jennifer began paying attention to other families that had left the community during her first year in Willowbrook. In each case, the departing residents had somehow failed to meet the unwritten but rigorously enforced standards related to property maintenance, lifestyle decisions, or social participation. Families with children considered too loud, homeowners who chose unconventional landscaping, and residents who refused to participate in community organizations all ended up moving after experiencing different forms of pressure that made their lives increasingly difficult. Jennifer's investigation into the garden club's activities took a dangerous turn when she discovered evidence of the organization's most serious crimes. While volunteering to organize the club's archives, she found files documenting the systematic surveillance of residents considered problematic. The files contained photographs of properties, records of visitors and activities, and detailed notes about family dynamics and financial circumstances. Even more disturbing were the records showing that garden club members had coordinated with local officials to ensure that selected residents faced bureaucratic obstacles, tax assessments, and regulatory problems that pressured them to move. The club maintained relationships with code enforcement inspectors, assessors, and service providers willing to participate in campaigns against families who did not conform to community expectations. The most shocking discovery was evidence that the Garden Club had been responsible for several deaths classified as accidents or natural causes. Elderly residents who refused to sell their homes despite the pressure campaigns had died under suspicious circumstances, often after suffering medical emergencies that prevented them from calling for help in time to survive. Jennifer found documentation of at least 6 deaths during the last decade that followed the same pattern. Elderly homeowners who had been targeted by the Garden Club experienced sudden health crises, many times related to falls or medication errors, leading to delayed discovery and fatal outcomes. In each case, the deceased person's property was quickly purchased by buyers with connections to Garden Club members. When Jennifer tried to investigate those deaths by reviewing newspaper obituaries and public records, she discovered that Detective Mike O'Brien, who had investigated several of the cases, was married to a prominent member of the Garden Club. The detective had consistently concluded that the deaths were accidental, despite the existence of evidence that could have justified more thorough investigations. Jennifer understood that she had discovered a criminal conspiracy that used the respectable facade of a suburban women's organization to systematically control who could live in Willowbrook. The Garden Club operated as a mechanism of social enforcement that eliminated residents who threatened property values, social cohesion, or the established power structure that kept the community exclusive and carefully controlled. Her attempt to expose the Garden Club's activities almost cost her life. After contacting law enforcement authorities outside Willowbrook's jurisdiction, Jennifer began experiencing the same types of harassment that had been used against other targeted residents. Her house was vandalized, her car was sabotaged, and she received anonymous threats warning her to stop spreading false accusations against respected members of the community. The situation escalated when Jennifer returned home after work and found that someone had entered her house and left a potted plant on the kitchen table. The plant was a beautiful arrangement of oleander flowers, which Jennifer recognized as highly poisonous. The message was clear. The Garden Club had the ability to enter her house whenever it wanted and possessed knowledge that could be used to eliminate her if she continued threatening its operations. Jennifer contacted the FBI and handed over evidence of the Garden Club's criminal activities. But the investigation was complicated because of the organization's deep connections inside Willowbrook's government and law enforcement agencies. Several club members were wives of municipal officials, and the organization's charitable activities had created ties with politicians and community leaders who resisted believing that their neighbors were capable of committing systematic murder. The federal investigation eventually resulted in the arrests of Victoria Sterling and 11 other members of the Garden Club on charges including conspiracy, elder abuse, insurance fraud, and multiple counts of murder. The evidence revealed that the organization had been responsible for at least 14 deaths over 15 years, using various methods to eliminate residents who represented threats to its vision of suburban perfection. Jennifer Walsh moved away from Willowbrook before the trials concluded, unable to keep living in a community where beautification projects had served as cover for the systematic elimination of unwanted neighbors. The legacy of the Garden Club continues to influence the town, where property values remain high and gardens are still perfectly maintained, but where potential residents are carefully examined to make sure they understand the true cost of suburban paradise. Story 6. Kevin Murphy should have suspected that something was wrong from the moment the invitation arrived in his mailbox, printed on expensive letterhead bearing the crest of the Pine Valley Sportsman's Lodge. He had never heard of the organization, despite having hunted throughout Idaho for more than 20 years. In addition, the invitation was addressed to him personally, not sent generally to the members of any hunting club he belonged to. The letter praised his reputation as an ethical hunter and outdoor enthusiast, and extended him an exclusive invitation to participate in a special hunting event that would take place on private land near Pine Valley, a remote town of 678 residents located in the central region of the state. The invitation was signed by William Crenshaw, who identified himself as the lodge master, and included detailed information about lodging, meals, and the equipment that would be provided during the 3-day event. Participants were asked to bring only personal clothing and their hunting licenses, since all firearms, ammunition, and specialized equipment would be supplied by the lodge. The event fee was surprisingly low, barely enough to cover basic expenses, and the letter emphasized that this was an opportunity for serious hunters to experience something truly unique. Kevin was intrigued, although his natural skepticism warned him to distrust unsolicited invitations. He had recently retired from his job as a Forest Service ranger and was looking for the new outdoor adventures to fill his time. The Pine Valley area was beautiful but sparsely populated, offering the kind of experience in nearly untouched wilderness that was becoming increasingly rare, as Idaho's outdoor recreation industry attracted more visitors each year. He accepted the invitation and arranged to drive to Pine Valley for the designated weekend in October. The town itself was exactly what Kevin expected from a small Idaho community. Main Street consisted of a few blocks of weathered buildings that housed a general store, a cafe, a gas station, and a handful of other businesses meant to meet the needs of local ranchers and loggers. The Pine Valley Sportsman's Lodge stood on a hill overlooking the town, a massive log structure that appeared to have been built in the 1920s as a retreat for wealthy hunters from cities like Boise and Salt Lake City. Kevin was welcomed at the lodge by William Crenshaw, a distinguished man in his 70s who moved with the presence of someone accustomed to command. Crenshaw had a weathered face and the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life outdoors. His knowledge of hunting techniques and wildlife behavior became immediately clear during their conversation. He explained that the lodge had been operating for more than 50 years, organizing exclusive hunting events for members who shared a commitment to traditional outdoor values and ethical hunting practices. The other participants in that weekend's event were an interesting mix of hunters from different states across the American West. Among them were a retired military officer from Colorado, a successful businessman from Utah, a rancher from Montana, and several other men whose outdoor experience and financial means were obvious both in their conversations and in their equipment. All of them seemed to have been carefully selected for the event, although none could explain exactly how they had been identified and invited by the lodge. The first day followed a traditional format that Kevin found familiar and comfortable. The participants were divided into small groups and assigned to different hunting areas within the lodge's extensive private property. The terrain was spectacular, with dense forests, alpine meadows, and steep ridges that offered opportunities to hunt elk, deer, and other species abundant in the region. Kevin's group managed to take down 2 elk, and that night's dinner included venison from previous hunts, accompanied by stories and camaraderie around the lodge's enormous stone fireplace. The second day began to reveal disturbing aspects of the lodge's activities that Kevin had not anticipated. Instead of continuing with traditional hunting, the participants were introduced to what Crenshaw described as advanced hunting techniques, designed to test their skills against more challenging prey. The morning briefing included detailed maps of unfamiliar terrain and references to hunting methods that seemed to go far beyond normal outdoor practices. Kevin's discomfort increased when he was handed equipment that seemed excessive for hunting wildlife. In addition to a high-powered rifle and the usual hunting gear, he received night vision devices, trackers, and communication radios, items that suggested they would be pursuing prey far more dangerous than a deer or an elk. When Kevin asked about the unusual equipment, Crenshaw explained that the lodge specialized in hunting experiences that pushed participants to their limits and tested their abilities against worthy adversaries. The hunting area for the second day was deep in the wilderness, accessible only by all-terrain vehicles that transported the participants to a remote staging area before dawn. Kevin was paired with a retired military officer, a man named Colonel Richards, who seemed familiar with the lodge's more advanced hunting techniques. Richards explained that the Pine Valley Sportsman's Lodge was known in certain hunting circles for offering experiences that could not be found anywhere else. Hunting opportunities that attracted true outdoor experts looking for the ultimate test of their skills. Kevin began to understand what those supposed opportunities involved when they found the first proof that they were not hunting animals. Hidden among dense brush near a stream was a camp that showed signs of recent human occupation. The site included a tent, camping gear, and personal belongings, suggesting that someone had been living in the area for several days. The camp appeared to have been abandoned in a hurry, with food still scattered around an extinguished fire pit and clothing hanging from tree branches. Colonel Richards examined the site with professional thoroughness, pointing out details Kevin would have missed. The person who had been living there was inexperienced in wilderness survival, Richards explained, based on the poor choice of location, the weak shelter construction, and the careless disposal of waste, which would attract predators. More importantly, the person was probably still in the area, since they had fled the camp so recently that the tracks and other signs were still fresh. Kevin realized with growing horror that they were not hunting animals at all, but participating in some kind of human hunt. The prey Crenshaw had described as worthy adversaries were people, probably individuals brought to that remote wilderness area specifically to be hunted by clients who paid for the ultimate outdoor experience. The expensive equipment, the careful selection of participants, and the isolated location all made sense when viewed as parts of an organized human hunt, not legitimate wilderness recreation. His attempts to withdraw from the activity were met with firm resistance from Colonel Richards, who explained that participants who discovered the true nature of the lodge's activities were not permitted to leave until the hunting event had concluded. Kevin was now a witness to criminal activity and could not be allowed to report what he had seen to outside authorities. He would have to participate fully in the hunt, demonstrate his commitment to the lodge's special brotherhood, and prove that he could be trusted to keep the secret that protected the organization's operations. The hunt continued throughout the day as Kevin and Colonel Richards tracked their human prey through increasingly rugged terrain. Their target was a young woman who had been surviving in the wilderness for several days, probably after being released with minimal equipment and warned that she would be pursued by armed men who considered her elimination a recreational activity. Kevin could see proof of her growing desperation in the tracks and campsites they found, signs that she was becoming exhausted and making increasingly poor decisions in her attempt to avoid capture. Kevin tried to sabotage the hunt by providing false information about the tracks and suggesting wrong directions when Colonel Richards asked him about the prey's possible movements. But Richards had enough experience to detect Kevin's deception. By afternoon, it became clear that Kevin's own survival might depend on his cooperation. Richards made subtle but unmistakable threats about what happened to lodge participants who proved unreliable or put the organization's security at risk. The hunt reached its climax near sunset, when they tracked the prey to a rocky ledge where she had taken shelter in a small cave. Colonel Richards positioned Kevin to block one escape route while he approached the cave from another direction, intending to force the woman into the open, where he could easily shoot her. Kevin found himself facing an impossible choice: participate in a murder or risk his own life by refusing to cooperate with the hunt. His decision was made when Ranger Lisa Jong unexpectedly appeared on the ridge above his position, apparently investigating reports of illegal hunting activity in the area. Zhang was armed and clearly suspicious of what she had observed. She demanded identification from Kevin and Colonel Richards while positioning herself to cover both men with her service weapon. Kevin understood that the Ranger's arrival was his only chance to escape the Lodge's criminal activities and reveal what he had witnessed. He quickly explained to Lisa Zhang that he had been deceived about the true nature of the hunting event and that there was a woman hiding in the cave, being pursued by Lodge members. Colonel Richards tried to convince the Ranger that Kevin was suffering from altitude sickness and confusion, but Zhang had enough experience to recognize signs of criminal activity when she saw them. She called for backup over the radio while maintaining control over both men. Within hours, the remote hunting area was filled with law enforcement officers. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of the Pine Valley Sportsman's Lodge's criminal operations. The organization had been running a human hunting business for more than 15 years, kidnapping victims from other states and transporting them to Idaho, where wealthy clients paid enormous sums to hunt them through remote wilderness areas. The victims were generally homeless people, runaway teenagers, and other individuals whose disappearances would not trigger immediate police investigations. The lodge master, William Crenshaw, and 17 other members were arrested on charges including kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, and multiple counts of murder. The investigation revealed that the lodge had been responsible for the deaths of at least 43 people over 15 years, operating under the facade of a legitimate hunting organization while offering the ultimate outdoor experience to clients who had grown bored with hunting animals. Kevin Murphy's testimony was crucial in securing convictions against the lodge members, but the experience left him unable to hunt recreationally ever again. He had discovered that his beloved outdoor activities could be corrupted into something monstrous by people who saw human life as another kind of prey, something to be pursued and killed for entertainment. The Pine Valley Sportsman's Lodge building still stands on its hill overlooking the town, but it has remained abandoned since the arrests. It serves as a reminder that even the most respected community organizations can hide unspeakable evil behind facades of tradition and respectability. The small town of Pine Valley has struggled to recover from the revelation that one of its most prominent institutions was actually a criminal enterprise that murdered dozens of innocent people. Many residents knew about the lodge's exclusive hunting events, but they never suspected that wealthy visitors were paying to hunt human beings instead of wild animals. The economic impact of losing the business generated by the lodge has been devastating for local merchants and service providers who depended on the income produced by the organization's activities. Ranger Lisa Zhang received recognition for her role in exposing the lodge's crimes, but she too was deeply affected by discovering that a trusted community institution had been operating a systematic murder business. Her investigation revealed that several local officials had been aware of suspicious activities at the lodge, but had chosen to ignore them because of the economic benefits the organization brought to the community. The corruption and willful blindness that allowed the lodge's operations to continue for so many years demonstrated how easily small communities can become complicit in unspeakable crimes when those crimes are committed by wealthy and respected organizations. Story 7. Michelle Thompson had been looking for a meaningful way to volunteer ever since she moved to Maplewood, Wisconsin, a picturesque town of 17,189 residents nestled among rolling hills covered with maple and oak forests. Her husband's promotion had brought them from Milwaukee to that charming community, where Main Street was lined with well-preserved 19th century buildings, and neighbors still greeted one another from the front porches of their homes. Michelle had always believed in the importance of giving back to the community, and the Maplewood Service League seemed like the perfect organization to channel her desire to help others. The Service League had been operating for more than 30 years, offering a wide variety of charitable services to families in need throughout the region. Its programs included a food pantry, emergency assistance for families facing financial crises, after-school tutoring for struggling students, and a summer camp program intended for children from low-income households. The organization was highly respected throughout central Wisconsin and regularly received grants from foundations and government agencies that recognized its effective work combating poverty and social problems in rural communities. Hannah Brooks, the executive director of the Service League, was an impressive woman in her 50s who had dedicated her career to nonprofit work. She had founded the organization after realizing that small towns like Maplewood often lacked the social services available in larger cities, leaving vulnerable families with nowhere to turn when they faced hardship. Under her leadership, the Service League had grown from a small group of volunteers into a professionally managed organization with an annual budget of more than $2 million in programs that served hundreds of families each year. Michelle was immediately impressed by the scope and effectiveness of the Service League's work when she attended her first volunteer orientation session. The organization operated out of a remodeled warehouse on the outskirts of town, with separate areas for food distribution, clothing donations, administrative offices, and program activities. The place was full of movement. Volunteers sorted donations, prepared meals, and coordinated services for clients who arrived throughout the day seeking help. Hannah Brooks explained that the Service League served families across a wide geographic area, including many clients who traveled from other counties to access services that were not available in their own communities. The organization had developed a reputation for providing help without judgment, offering assistance to anyone who needed it, regardless of their circumstances or background. That approach had made the Service League an especially effective institution for reaching families who might be reluctant to seek help from government agencies or traditional charities. Michelle was assigned to the organization's Family Assistance Program, which provided emergency help to households facing immediate crises such as evictions, utility shutoffs, or medical emergencies. Her role consisted of interviewing clients to assess their needs, connecting them with appropriate resources, and following up to make sure the assistance provided had been effective. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply rewarding. Michelle could see the immediate impact of her efforts on families struggling to survive. During her first weeks as a volunteer, Michelle was struck by the number of families with children who came to the Service League for help. Many of those families were headed by single mothers who worked multiple jobs but still could not cover their expenses, in an economy that offered few opportunities for people without college degrees. The children in those families often showed signs of chronic stress and malnutrition, and Michelle was moved by their resilience in circumstances that would have tested even most adults. Hannah Brooks seemed especially committed to helping children. She frequently spent additional time with the youngest clients, making sure they received not only material assistance but also emotional support and words of encouragement. She often mentioned her own difficult childhood in conversations with volunteers, explaining that her personal experiences had motivated her to dedicate her life to protecting vulnerable children from the trauma and neglect she herself had suffered. That personal connection to the work made her an inspiring leader, capable of attracting both dedicated volunteers and generous donors. Michelle's first sign that something was wrong in the Service League's operations came when she noticed inconsistencies in the way certain families were treated by the organization. Some clients received extensive assistance and ongoing support, while others received minimal help and seemed to be discouraged from returning for additional services. The differences did not seem to be based on need or circumstances, since some families that received less support appeared to be in more desperate situations than those receiving preferential treatment. When Michelle asked Hannah Brooks about those disparities, she was told that the organization had to make difficult decisions about resource allocation and that some families were better positioned to benefit from assistance than others. Families that demonstrated commitment to improving their situation and followed the Service League's recommendations were more likely to receive ongoing support, while those that seemed unable or unwilling to make positive changes received temporary help but not long-term investment. Michelle found that explanation troubling because it seemed to contradict the Service League's stated mission of helping anyone who needed assistance. She began paying closer attention to which families received different levels of service, and gradually realized that the pattern was more disturbing than simple resource distribution decisions. Families with particularly attractive or well-behaved children seemed to receive more attention from Hannah Brooks and other staff members, while families with shy, traumatized, or difficult-to-manage children often received minimal assistance. Her concerns grew when she noticed that some of the children participating in the Service League's programs seemed to develop unusually close relationships with staff members and volunteers. These children arrived early for activities and stayed late after programs ended, spending time in private conversations with adults who gave them special attention and gifts and privileges that were not available to other participants. Michelle recognized those patterns from her training as a teacher, where she had learned to identify possible warning signs of inappropriate relationships between adults and minors. The situation became more alarming when Michelle discovered that the Service League kept detailed files on all the families it served, including photographs and personal information that seemed to go far beyond what was necessary to provide assistance. The files contained observations about family dynamics, evaluations of parents' abilities and reliability, and detailed descriptions of the children's personalities, appearance, and behavior. Some files included notes about which minors might be suitable for the organization's special programs that were not described in any of the Service League's public materials. Michelle's investigation into those special programs revealed that the Service League was conducting activities that were not disclosed to volunteers, donors, or the families it served. Children identified as suitable candidates were invited to participate in overnight camps, weekend trips, and other activities that separated them from their families for extended periods. Parents were presented with these programs as educational and recreational opportunities that would benefit children from disadvantaged backgrounds, but the actual activities were not documented in any materials Michelle could access. When Michelle tried to learn more about those special programs by asking other volunteers, she received evasive answers and suggestions that she should focus on her assigned duties instead of asking questions about activities that did not concern her. Hannah Brooks became noticeably colder toward Michelle after she began asking about the undisclosed programs, and other staff members seemed to monitor her interactions with clients and her access to the organization's records. Michelle's decisive breakthrough came when a former client approached her. The woman's daughter had participated several years earlier in one of the Service League's special programs. The woman had been reluctant to talk about her experiences with the organization, but she was becoming increasingly concerned about what had happened to her daughter during the time she had spent in the Service League's care. The girl had returned from the special programs changed, showing signs of trauma and refusing to talk about what had happened during her participation. The former client explained that several other families had had similar experiences with children who had participated in the Service League's special programs. The minors had been selected because of their vulnerability and because of their families' desperate need for assistance, which made it unlikely that the parents would ask difficult questions or file complaints about the organization's activities. The programs had provided opportunities for adults to abuse children who had no other sources of support and whose families depended on help from the Service League. Michelle understood that the Service League was functioning as a front for a child trafficking and abuse network that used charitable programs to identify and gain access to vulnerable minors. The organization's reputation as an entity dedicated to helping families in need provided perfect cover for its criminal activities. Since parents felt grateful for the assistance and were unlikely to question the motives of people offering their children opportunities they could not afford. The detailed files maintained by the organization were, in reality, profiles used to select minors for abuse and to assess the likelihood that their families would report suspicious activities. Her attempt to report these discoveries to the local police was complicated by the fact that Police Chief Anthony Silva was a longtime supporter of the Service League and had received several community service awards from the organization. Silva was reluctant to investigate Michelle's accusations, suggesting that she had misunderstood the Service League's activities and was making unfounded allegations against respected members of the community who had dedicated their lives to helping others. Michelle's investigation revealed that the Service League's criminal activities went beyond child abuse and included systematic financial fraud that had been going on for years. The organization had been claiming to serve far more families than it actually helped, inflating its numbers to qualify for larger grants and donations. Money intended to provide services to families in need was being diverted to sustain the special programs and pay for activities that had nothing to do with legitimate charitable work. Even more disturbing was the evidence that children abused through the Service League's programs were sometimes permanently separated from their families through fraudulent reports to Child Protective Services. The organization claimed that the parents were neglectful or abusive, providing false documentation to support its accusations, and ensuring that the children were placed in foster homes controlled by Service League members. Those minors essentially disappeared into a system designed to keep them permanently available for continued abuse. Michelle contacted federal law enforcement agencies when it became clear that local authorities were unwilling or unable to investigate the Service League's activities. The FBI investigation that followed revealed that the organization had been operating a sophisticated child trafficking network for more than 15 years, using its legitimate charitable programs as a front for the systematic abuse of vulnerable children. Hannah Brooks and 12 other Service League staff members and volunteers were arrested on charges including child trafficking, sexual abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The investigation revealed that the organization had abused more than 60 children over 15 years, using its positions of trust and authority to exploit families that had nowhere else to turn for help. Michelle Thompson's courage in exposing the Service League's criminal activities saved countless children from future abuse, but the experience changed her forever after she discovered that trusted community organizations could be weaponized against society's most vulnerable members. The Service League building in Maplewood still remains empty, its windows boarded up, as a reminder that even the most respected charitable organizations can hide unspeakable evil behind facades of compassion and community service. The town of Maplewood has struggled to recover from the revelation that one of its most celebrated organizations was actually a criminal enterprise that preyed on the children and families most in need of help. Many residents had volunteered with the Service League or donated money to support its programs. Discovering that their good intentions had been manipulated to facilitate child abuse left the community wondering whether it could truly trust any organization that claimed to be helping others. The children and families victimized by the Service League continue to face the trauma of their experiences, knowing that the people they trusted and depended on were using their vulnerability to harm them. The case has become a warning about the importance of oversight and accountability in charitable organizations, as well as the need for communities to remain vigilant in protecting their most vulnerable members from those who would seek to exploit their trust and desperation. Story 8. James Patterson had always felt a deep fascination with genealogy. He spent weekends tracing family trees and documenting the stories of ancestors who had lived and died long before he was born. When he inherited his grandmother's collection of family documents and photographs, he decided to thoroughly investigate the Patterson family history, hoping to create a complete record that future generations could value and preserve. His search led him to Blackwater, North Carolina, a small town of 1,045 residents, where his great-great-grandfather had settled in the 1890s after emigrating from Scotland. Blackwater lay in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, surrounded by dense forests and rolling farmland that had changed very little since the town's founding. The community had grown around a sawmill that processed timber from the nearby mountains, and many of the original families still owned properties that had been in their hands for more than a century. Main Street preserved its 19th century character, with brick buildings housing businesses that served both local residents and tourists who visited the area for its scenic beauty and historical significance. The Blackwater Heritage Foundation operated out of a restored Victorian mansion that served as both a museum and a research center for anyone interested in the town's history. The foundation had been established in 1964 by prominent local families who wanted to preserve documents, artifacts, and stories that recorded the community's development from a frontier logging camp into a stable agricultural town. Margaret Caldwell, the foundation's current director, was a distinguished woman in her 70s whose own family had been among Blackwater's original settlers. James was warmly welcomed when he contacted the foundation to research his family history. Margaret Caldwell personally guided him through its extensive archives, which included birth and death records, property deeds, business ledgers, and thousands of photographs that chronicled life in Blackwater from its earliest days. The foundation maintained detailed genealogical records for most of the families that had lived in the area, creating an exhaustive database that researchers could use to trace connections between different branches of their family trees. The Patterson family records were especially extensive. They documented 5 generations of births, marriages, deaths, and property transactions, offering a detailed picture of how James's ancestors had lived and worked in the Blackwater area. His great-great-grandfather had arrived with very little money, but gradually accumulated land and built a successful farming operation that supported his descendants for decades. The family had been active in community affairs, serving on church boards, school committees, and various civic organizations that had influenced the town's development. James was impressed by the foundation's meticulous record preservation and its obvious dedication to safeguarding local history. Margaret Caldwell seemed to know intimate details about every family that had ever lived in Blackwater, and her stories brought the dry data of the archives to life through anecdotes about personalities, relationships, and events that had shaped the character of the community. She encouraged James to take all the time he needed to review the records, offering to help him understand the context behind the documents he was discovering. During his research, James began to notice patterns in the foundation's archives that seemed unusual for an ordinary small town. Certain families had extraordinarily detailed documentation, with records that tracked not only basic vital statistics but also personality traits, talents, health conditions, and other characteristics that seemed to go far beyond normal genealogical research. Some files included photographs and notes documenting multiple generations of the same families, creating profiles that looked more like breeding records than family histories. Even stranger was the foundation's practice of maintaining what they called connection maps, which tracked relationships between different families over several generations. These elaborate charts showed not only marriages and direct family ties, but also more distant connections, including friendships, business partnerships, and other associations that had linked various families over time. The maps were incredibly detailed, suggesting that the foundation had invested enormous effort in tracking even minor relationships among members of the community. James's curiosity intensified when he discovered that his own family appeared prominently in those connection maps, with detailed annotations about members of the Patterson family dating back to his great-great-grandfather's arrival in Blackwater. The map showed connections to dozens of other families in the area, creating a network of relationships that seemed to include practically every person who had ever lived in the town. Some annotations included references to characteristics and abilities that had been passed down through different family lines, as if the foundation were tracking genetic traits across multiple generations. When James asked Margaret Caldwell about those unusual records, she explained that the foundation took a comprehensive approach to documenting local history. Understanding the connections between families was essential to preserving the complete story of how the community had developed, and tracking characteristics across generations helped explain why certain families had been particularly successful or influential in town affairs. The Foundation's mission, she said, was to ensure that future researchers had access to complete information about their ancestors and about the place they occupied within community history. James found that explanation plausible until he began noticing references in the Foundation's records to families that, apparently, had been encouraged or even pressured to enter marriages based on recommendations from community leaders. The files contained correspondence between prominent families discussing possible marriages between their children, with detailed analysis of how those unions would benefit the community's genetic heritage. Some letters were quite explicit about the goal of ensuring that desirable traits would be passed on to future generations, while avoiding marriages that might introduce unwanted characteristics. The pattern became even more disturbing when James discovered records showing that families that refused to follow the Foundation's marriage recommendations sometimes faced social and economic pressure that forced them to leave Blackwater entirely. Property records showed that non-compliant families often sold their land below market value to Foundation board members or their allies, suggesting that economic coercion had been used to enforce compliance with the community's breeding program. James understood that the Blackwater Heritage Foundation was not merely preserving local history, but had been operating a systematic program to control which families remained in the community and whom they were allowed to marry. The Foundation's extensive genealogical records were actually breeding charts designed to maintain genetic lines that the organization's leadership considered desirable, while eliminating families whose characteristics were considered problematic or inferior. His investigation revealed that this program had been operating for more than 60 years, with Foundation leaders acting as unofficial matchmakers who arranged marriages between young people whose family lines were considered genetically compatible. Children who refused to marry according to the Foundation's recommendations were often ostracized within the community, denied employment opportunities, and pressured to move to places where their genetic heritage would not contaminate the carefully maintained bloodlines of Blackwater's founding families. Even more horrifying was James's discovery that the Foundation had participated in the systematic elimination of individuals whose genetic makeup was considered undesirable. The records contained documentation of suspicious deaths, unexplained disappearances, and forced institutionalizations that had removed dozens of people from the community over the decades. Individuals with physical disabilities, mental illness, or other conditions the Foundation considered genetic defects had been systematically eliminated to prevent them from reproducing and passing their characteristics to future generations. The Foundation's activities went beyond controlling marriages and included monitoring the health and development of all children born in the community. The organization kept detailed records of every child's physical and mental characteristics, identifying those who showed signs of unwanted traits that needed to be addressed before they reached reproductive age. Children considered genetically inferior were often removed from their families through fabricated reports to social services and then placed in institutions where they could not reproduce. James's investigation revealed that his own family had participated in this breeding program for generations, with Patterson marriages carefully arranged to enhance desired genetic traits and avoid combinations that might produce undesirable characteristics. His grandparents, his parents, and even his own birth had been planned and approved by Foundation leaders who had analyzed the genetic heritage of both family lines to ensure that the union would produce offspring with the desired physical and mental attributes. The revelation that his entire family history had been manipulated by a secret breeding program was already devastating. But James's investigation brought to light an even more disturbing truth about the Foundation's ultimate goals. The organization was not simply trying to improve the genetic makeup of Blackwater's population, but was part of a broader network conducting genetic experiments designed to create superior human beings for the use of powerful individuals and organizations outside the community. The bloodlines carefully maintained by the Foundation were, in reality, breeding stock for a human trafficking operation that supplied genetically superior individuals to wealthy clients who wanted children with specific physical and mental characteristics. Young people who had been raised according to the Foundation's specifications were systematically removed from Blackwater through false opportunities, arranged marriages with outsiders, or direct kidnappings, and then delivered to buyers who had paid enormous sums for access to genetically engineered human beings. James discovered records showing that dozens of Blackwater residents had been sold over the decades, with their disappearances explained as voluntary relocations or educational opportunities that had taken them to other parts of the country. In reality, those people had been delivered to buyers who wanted servants, surrogate mothers, organ donors, or subjects for medical experimentation, with their genetic heritage carefully documented to ensure that the buyers received exactly what they had requested. The Foundation's breeding program had created multiple generations of individuals specifically designed to meet the demands of various markets for genetically superior human beings. Some family lines had been bred for physical strength and endurance, others for intelligence and creativity, and still others for specific physical characteristics valued by certain buyers. The entire community of Blackwater had essentially become a human breeding farm operated under the facade of historical preservation and genealogical research. When James tried to expose the Foundation's activities, he discovered that the municipal clerk, Diana Foster, was actually Margaret Caldwell's daughter and a key participant in the administrative operations of the breeding program. Foster had been responsible for maintaining the official records that concealed the Foundation's criminal activities, creating false documentation that supported the stories used to explain disappearances and forced relocations. James's investigation was interrupted when he was approached by Foundation security personnel who had been monitoring his research activities. The Foundation had discovered that he was asking too many questions and accessing records that revealed the true nature of its operations. James was informed that he would have to become a permanent resident of Blackwater, where his research activities could be properly supervised, and his genetic heritage could contribute to the community's breeding program. The confrontation with the Foundation's personnel convinced James that he was in immediate danger and that he needed to escape Blackwater before becoming another victim of its human trafficking operation. He managed to copy the most incriminating records and fled the town under cover of darkness, eventually reaching federal law enforcement agencies that were already investigating reports of missing persons and human trafficking activity in rural areas of North Carolina. The FBI investigation that followed revealed that the Blackwater Heritage Foundation had been operating one of the most sophisticated human breeding and trafficking networks ever discovered in the United States. Margaret Caldwell, Diana Foster, and 19 other Foundation members were arrested on charges including human trafficking, kidnapping, conspiracy, and murder. The investigation revealed that the organization had been responsible for the disappearance of more than 130 people over 50 years, using its genealogical research activities as cover for the systematic breeding and sale of human beings. James Patterson never returned to Blackwater after testifying in the trials that finally convicted the Foundation's leaders. His genealogical research had revealed that his entire family history had been fabricated and manipulated by criminals who had used genetic engineering to create human beings meant to be sold to the highest bidder. The discovery that even his own existence had been planned and controlled by traffickers left him questioning everything he had believed about his identity and heritage. The town of Blackwater continues to exist, but most of the original families have scattered to other areas where their genetic heritage is not part of the public record. The Heritage Foundation building now stands empty. Its archives were seized as evidence in ongoing investigations into the network of human trafficking operations that had used small American towns as breeding facilities for more than half a century.